Dice Ain't Nice in episode 101 of Game Boy Works. I feel like it's been a while since we last saw a puzzle-type game on Game Boy, but much like the icy hand of death, the need to move patterned blocks around is never far behind you on this platform. In this case, the proverbial hand of death takes the form of a game called Palamedes. You may be familiar with Palamedes from its NES version, which saw a release in the US. Palamedes for Game Boy did not, instead following in the footsteps of several other recent titles like Boulder Dash, Sunsoft Grand Prix, and Poppin' Twinbee to have skipped the US in favor of Japanese and European exclusivity. It's not that big a loss though. Palamedes is basically like someone's half-baked attempt to come up with the idea for Magical Drop. It's okay, I guess, but there's not really much meat to the game, and Game Boy's lack of color support hurts Palamedes more than any other game that comes to mind at the moment. I mentioned last episode that you would have every reason to expect a game like Poppin' Twinbee, whose console and arcade versions featured color as a key play mechanic, to suffer in Game Boy's monochromatic ecosystem. Yet it turned out fine thanks to some deft use of shading and contrast. Palamedes, on the other hand, perfectly embodies the hazards of bringing a color-centric game concept to Game Boy. This version is vastly more difficult than its console counterparts, and those were pretty tough to begin with. In Palamedes, you control a little person running back and forth, tossing blocks toward the top of the screen as rows of blocks descend toward the bottom. Again, it will likely remind contemporary players of Magical Drop, a series that Data East debuted 5 years after Palamedes hit the scene. First isn't always best in this case, though. Unlike Magical Drop, the play mechanics here are extremely simplistic. One button tosses blocks, and the other cycles through the pieces you're carrying. The blocks in Palamedes are actually dice, and you can make a die on the descending stack vanish by hitting it with another die of the same value. You don't have the ability, as in Magical Drop, to pull blocks out of the stack, and there are no abilities for comboing. When you strike a like die, only the die you hit disappears. You can't clear out multiple interconnected dice at once, or cause the stack to collapse upward by removing dice behind the frontmost row. So the play here boils down entirely to clearing out one block at a time by rapidly cycling to bring up the appropriate die value on the blocks that you're throwing. In the other incarnations of Palamedes, each die has its own color assignment: blue, green, pink, purple, yellow, and brown. On Game Boy though, all numeric values are one of two shades of gray. Now, that might not be an impossible setup for a puzzle game. Tetris made gray work, Dr. Mario made gray work, Flipple made gray work. Palamedes, alas, does not make gray work. The problem is in the nature and design of the pieces. Every block in Palamedes is simply a square, one face of a die. There are 6 possible faces, but on Game Boy, those faces only come in 2 tones. So you have to read the number of dots per side, rather than being able to know at a glance which dice you're dealing with based on color. With the odd numbers, that's fine. 1, 3, and 5 are visually distinct from one another, so they read quickly. The even numbers, though, especially 4 and 6, look much less distinct from one another, and they can easily trip you up. It's a small thing, but in a game this fast-paced and difficult, you really need every design detail working in your favor. Trying to parse the number of dots on a sea of mostly identical-looking squares on a 2-inch screen is not really a load of fun. It doesn't help that Palamedes itself isn't fundamentally all that interesting. It offers solo play or head-to-head play against another player, but there's not any real depth to the mechanics. The block tossing isn't even as involving as what we saw in Flipple. There's also one other gameplay option, a tournament mode. This allows you to compete against a computer in a CPU-driven version of the 2-player mode. Boy howdy does the CPU not have any issues with identifying patterns on the dice. I have to admit, I have little experience with this game and I'm not all that great at it, but the very first computer opponent you face is absolutely savage. She's able to cycle through her dice sets a lot more fluidly than the controls allow the player to. I have to assume it gets worse from there, but I couldn't really say. I didn't make it very far because playing Palamedes mostly makes me just want to boot up like Magical Drop 3 on Switch, you know? It appears this port of Palamedes was the first project co-developed by a studio called Natsu System, a short-lived developer that eventually shifted over to Arrow Games. Ain't that always the way? Publisher Hot B, on the other hand, was a bit of an 8 and 16-bit mainstay thanks primarily to their Black Bass and Blue Marlin fishing sims. Palamedes was their first Game Boy release, though, and apparently one of only 3 they would ever produce. About the only note of interest here is that the lack of hot bee fishing games on Game Boy left the door wide open for Natsume, who are no known relation to Natsu's system, to explode into stardom with Legend of the River King. Still, this release isn't the most impressive way to kick off a Game Boy career. On a system crammed full of puzzlers, you really gotta bring your A game in order to stand out. And Palamedes barely rates a C. Oh well. Next on Game Boy Works, who you gonna call? That's right, HAL Labs, baby.